Many animals on Earth are able to communicate by producing different sounds. Human beings have developed not only the means of simple communication, but the ability to transmit complex and abstract ideas through an amazing tool, human language. Human language is arguably the most important development of the species since we learned to walk on two legs. Our ability to cooperate depends largely on language and communication. Anthropologists debate exactly when and how our species first acquired the ability for language. Estimates range from as recently as 50,000 years to as far back as 2 million years ago. Whether it resulted from a sudden genetic mutation or a gradual evolution is another open question. At some point in time, our voice box moved down into the throat, something which enables us to make an incredible range of sounds compared to other species in our family tree. In one Living Law episode, we even learned how to communicate with one of our relative species, the mountain gorilla.
So when you get to the gorillas, we'll be having a different, we won't talk English anymore, we'll be talking a gorilla language. So when you say, somebody say, or a gorilla or one of us say, this is a person which means hello or how are you. Also there's another one which is kind of warning when it's saying, this is a warning. We might be either coming too close, we may say,
Understanding how other species communicate can make for some incredible interactions. While other species make similar sounds wherever they are located, humans have developed an array of languages which are often mutually unintelligible. Why this is the case is another fascinating question. There may be just as much value in a group having outsiders unable to understand their communications as in having insiders able to understand them. If the ability to speak arose in one individual or group at a certain time, why didn't the language remain the same, even as the scope of its vocabulary expanded? Human language seems to have evolved just like the species itself, so that today there are thousands of individual languages. Did human migration cause some original prototype language to splinter and diverge so dramatically that over time languages became mutually unrecognizable? Some human belief systems have their own explanations for the situation. The Bible, for example, contains the story of the Tower of Babel. In it, humans originally speaking a soul language attempted to reach the heavens and the divine by building a massive tower stretching upwards. God, displeased with the plan, destroyed the growing tower and scattered the humans across the region. In so doing, he changed the language spoken by different groups so that one group could not understand the other. No common language, no cooperation. No cooperation, no tower. The result, peace and tranquility preserved in heaven. Whether one follows the biblical account or some migration evolution theory, the topic of language is a fundamental one in relation to law. Specific languages house the rules which aim to regulate behavior in the societies which use them. In the Living Law Nation series, we consider the central role and uniqueness of individual languages. For travelers, the level of comprehension of a local language can make all the difference in terms of the richness of the travel experience. Just as language has the ability to unite members of a group through common stories, songs, sayings, and more, it also can create a wall between societies. Misunderstandings can lead to outright conflict, which is covered in more detail in another Living Law Topical episode. In part 1 of this topical episode, we focus on the interdependency between law and language. In part 2, we consider issues of language policy, the selection of a primary language, and issues arising in multilingual societies. In part 3, we conclude by looking at language as the subject of law and how some societies attempt to influence the use and evolution of specific languages. In examining the interdependency between law and language, we will focus on two key points: form and transparency. In terms of form, communication of any kind, including about rules and law, can be oral or written. When our ancestors were still hunter-gatherers, always on the move, oral communication was the natural preference. Knowledge was preserved in people's heads and passed on through the oral tradition. It was not practical to lug around objects which contained that same information. When humans began to settle down, particularly following the Agrarian Revolution, this became less of an issue. At the same time, communal living in ever larger groups fed the need for more and more complex rules. The invention of writing provided the alternative of storing such rules in or on physical objects, as opposed to between someone's ears. This touches upon another key aspect of law, the level of transparency around rules in any given society. Naturally, the form of communication, oral or written, has fundamental consequences for the underlying question of transparency. Early African societies generally relied on the oral form. It is easier to control knowledge about rules and law if it is not written and broadly communicated. Thus, form often goes hand in hand with the respective power structures in a society at any given time. We saw a number of examples of this in examining the history of specific nations. The king was considered divine and all-powerful and had supreme authority over all matters legislative, executive, and judicial. Law, or itegeko, was a solemn and ceremonial act through which the king introduced a new rule or changed an existing one. Changes in the rules of society were communicated using a special drum called the rukabugome and cascaded through the chiefs. Court officials known as abiru, generally 3 in number, were depositories of the esoteric code, the collective laws of the kingdom. It was thus a very influential position, with each abiru responsible for a different chapter of the law code. This included knowledge of the major secrets of a dynasty, such as under what circumstances a king could be replaced. A society's form of government is another key factor in the relationship between law and language. Democracy seems to mitigate against any tendency for intransparent systems of rules, at least in theory. If citizens are to behave in a certain way, they have to be aware of that societal expectation. Both the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations provide good examples of how some societies have managed this issue. Up until then, law had consisted of oral law, and enforcement was by blood feud. Laws were posted on three-sided wooden tablets known as axones. These were placed in public view in places like the agora to inform the populace about the law. But full transparency is not guaranteed even where law exists in written form. In Living Law Italy, we saw how a number of milestones were necessary before law became public knowledge in ancient Rome. In 462 BC, a plebeian by the name of Tentilius proposed that the law be written down and made known to the general public. Traditionally, access to the law had been restricted to the high priests, leading members of the patrician class, and members of the Senate. After considerable debate, a law commission known as the Decembri was created in 450 BC in order to compile the existing law at the time. The Decembri produced a draft set of laws set out on 10 tabula, or tables. In the words of the historian Livy, every citizen should quietly consider each point, then talk it over with his friends, and finally bring forward for public discussion any additions or subtractions which seem desirable. That process led to 2 additional tables being added to what came to be known as the 12 Tables. The 12 Tables set out the fundamental rules of the law of persons, property, and litigation, and reflected the customary laws in Roman society. They were hung in the Roman Forum so that each Roman could make him or herself familiar with the content. It would be a mistake to assume that society's use of the oral tradition died out long ago. There are still groups on the planet which rely primarily on knowledge being passed down orally. In Europe, the staying power of the oral tradition proved quite strong even long after the development of writing. The original settlers of Iceland relied on the oral tradition into the 2nd millennium AD. For most of the country's history, the Icelandic parliament took place in nature under open skies.
This really is a place of incredible natural beauty. You can understand why the members of the assembly might want to choose this location, if they're going to spend so much time here debating different things. Now, there's one place in particular that we have to find, and that's the Law Rock.
The Law Rock, though part of nature, was where all the legal action took place.
Well, we found it. The flagpole behind me is believed to be the site of the ancient Lurgberg, or Law Rock. And this was the most important location here during the Althing, or assembly. And it was here that the so-called law speaker would get up and announce or repeat the laws in force at that time. Now, because of the amount of laws, each year the law speaker would cover approximately 1/3 of the laws, but each year the law speaker was expected to go over the procedural law. So if you thought the bar exam was difficult, just imagine having to repeat and recite 1/3 of the body of law in existence.
A key turning point came with the introduction of Christianity into many European societies. The consistency of the Christian message was facilitated by its content existing in written form, the Holy Scriptures. Its spread was not always an easy task, and sometimes had to be achieved with forceful persuasion. The Icelandic sagas contain fascinating descriptions of the challenges of such transitions and the turmoil that often accompanied them. Whatever the trigger, religious conversion, or the policy of a ruling authority, once information takes on written form, the dynamics of transparency change completely. This became even more evident when technology dramatically lowered the cost and increased the speed at which information could be communicated. The development of the printing press highlighted the impact of societal leaders' ability to control information. It happened during a period of tremendous and heated debate about the nature and administration of divine law, something covered in a separate Living Law Topical episode. At this time, traditional forms of discussion and debate still relied primarily on oral arguments and oral counter-arguments. As the Protestant Reformation got underway, that began to change. The ability to quickly spread written information meant that debate and discussion, historically restricted to a select few in society, could now take place across entire societies. Exactly that happened during the Reformation, and the resulting divisions eventually boiled over into outright conflict. The combination of individual actions, such as Luther's translation of the Bible into German, and the widespread dissemination of it and other written material, contributed to the elimination of the historical monopoly enjoyed by the Church in Rome. There were tremendous knock-on effects to societal structures across the continent. Similar developments took place across the globe, accelerated by the growing trade and interaction between societies following the Age of Exploration. For that very reason, temporal authorities have often tried to control the form and content of human expression. Once again, that is something we explore in more detail in another Living Law Topical episode. It is difficult for us today to appreciate the full impact of milestones such as the invention of the printing press or the discovery of new worlds. Perhaps the closest thing in our time would be to compare life before and after the Internet. Yet even with freely flowing information, some areas of language seem to be not fully accessible to the general public. Law is often accused of this, with so-called legalese describing concepts fully comprehensible only to insiders. The issue of the comprehensibility of law has hardly disappeared since then. In fact, the volume and complexity of legal rules has given rise to the need for a special class of persons trained to understand law's content and explain it to others. We explore that dynamic in 2 other topical episodes of Living Law. In the next segment, we consider how a society chooses which language or languages its members should use.